Somewhere beneath the surface of 5 freshwater lakes sitting at the heart of North America, there are thousands of ships. Not metaphorically, not as legend. As physical objects resting on the bottom, some with their cargo still sealed inside, some with their bells still mounted, some with names you can still read if you descend far enough and look carefully enough through the dark. The number that gets cited most often is around 6,000. 6,000 documented sinkings across the Great Lakes, claimed by storms and ice and fire and fog and simple human miscalculation across roughly 2 centuries of commercial navigation. The Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum puts the death toll from those losses at approximately 30,000 lives. 30,000 people who set out on freshwater and never came back. And here is where the story already becomes uncomfortable. Because historian Mark Thompson has argued that the true number of wrecks is well over 25,000, meaning the 6,000 figure represents only those we managed to record, only those someone survived long enough to report, only those that left a trace in the paperwork of a young and chaotic nation still figuring out how to keep track of itself. The real number, whatever it is, belongs mostly to the water. This is not how most people think about the Great Lakes. They are lakes after all. You can stand on the shore of Lake Superior on a calm morning and watch the light come across the water and feel the peace of it. But the Great Lakes are not ordinary lakes in any meaningful sense of that word. Superior alone holds more water than all the other 4 combined. Its surface area exceeds the entire country of South Carolina. When a storm rises on these lakes, it behaves the way Atlantic storms behave, building steep, short-interval waves that can overwhelm a vessel faster than an open ocean swell ever could. Ships have gone down in minutes. Entire crews have been lost without a single distress call reaching shore. The lakes look like lakes. They kill like seas. So the central question that runs underneath everything you're about to hear is this. How did a system of inland waterways become one of the most dangerous stretches of navigation in the world? And why, even after 2 centuries of accumulated wreckage and grief, do the lakes continue to surprise us with what they have been keeping? The answer unfolds across a long arc of history that begins with wooden schooners and unreliable charts, and ends with autonomous underwater vehicles and side-scan sonar-finding ships that sank 100 years ago and were never found by anyone who was looking. Along the way, there are storms of almost incomprehensible scale, individual disasters that took dozens of lives in a single night, and a cast of vessels that became famous for how they died rather than for anything they carried. There are places on these lakes where the geography itself seems to concentrate danger, where the wind angles and the water depth and the shape of the shoreline conspire against any ship unlucky enough to be caught in the wrong conditions. Some of those places will come up again and again as this story moves forward. Whitefish Point on Lake Superior, where at least 240 vessels have gone down since the early 19th century, enough that the shoreline nearby eventually became known as the graveyard of the Great Lakes. The southern basin of Lake Michigan, which holds the highest concentration of wrecks of any of the 5 lakes. The Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary in Lake Huron, where nearly 200 documented wrecks lie within a defined underwater preserve. These are not just geographic coordinates. They are the anchors of a story about what happens when ambition meets weather and the margin for error is very thin. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of the internet. What makes this history particularly strange is the tension between how much we know and how much we do not. Some of these wrecks have been studied in extraordinary detail. Divers have photographed them, archaeologists have catalogued them, museums have built entire exhibitions around them. Others exist only as entries in a 19th century port ledger, a name and a date and a cargo and no further explanation. Others still have not been found at all, resting somewhere in water too deep or too cold or too far from shore for anyone to have reached them yet. Every few years, a sonar survey turns up something that was not on any map. A hull sitting perfectly upright in dark water, waiting. And the question becomes not just what the ship was, but why it took this long to find it. That gap between the recorded and the real, between the ships we know about and the ships the lakes are still keeping, is where a great deal of this story lives. It is a history that is still being written, still being corrected, still being pulled up from the bottom one wreck at a time. And it begins the way most Great Lakes stories begin, with someone loading cargo onto a wooden hull and trusting the water. The moment that changed everything happened on November 4th, 1825, when the Erie Canal officially opened and connected the Hudson River to Lake Erie, with a continuous ribbon of water stretching from the Atlantic coast deep into the American interior. Almost overnight, the Great Lakes stopped being a frontier and became a corridor. Goods that had taken weeks to move by wagon over uncertain roads could now travel by water, from Buffalo to Chicago, from Cleveland to Detroit, from the eastern ports all the way into the heart of a continent still being settled. The lakes had always been vast. Now they were useful in ways that demanded traffic, and traffic arrived. What followed was one of the most rapid commercial expansions in American history. Timber came first, cut from the dense forests ringing the upper lakes and floated south to feed the construction booms of growing cities. Then grain, pouring out of the new prairie farms by the bushel and loaded onto ships bound for the mills and markets of the east. Then iron ore, dug from the ranges of northern Michigan and Minnesota and shipped in quantities that would eventually build the steel industry of an entire nation. Then coal moving in the opposite direction, fueling furnaces and foundries and the engines of the ships carrying everything else. The lakes became a circulatory system, and the vessels working those routes were its blood. The ships that first took on this work were schooners, wooden-hulled and wind-driven, designed with the shallow draughts and broad beams the lakes required. They were not elegant in the way of ocean sailing ships. They were workhorses built fast and cheap at lakeside yards, rigged simply enough that small crews could manage them, and constructed to carry as much weight as the hull could bear. A typical schooner of the 1830s or 1840s might be crewed by 5 or 6 men, captained by someone who had learned the lakes from years of watching them, rather than from any formal training, and loaded so heavily that the deck sat just feet above the waterline. Alongside the schooners came the early wooden steamers, side-wheelers and propeller-driven vessels that offered more reliability in calm conditions and opened the lakes to passenger travel as well as freight. These were the ships that carried settlers west, families and their packed trunks crowding onto decks built for cargo, paying passage on vessels whose primary business was always the next load of timber or grain. But commerce expanded faster than understanding. The charts available to lake captains in the early and middle 19th century were incomplete at best and dangerously wrong at worst. Shoals that could tear a hull apart went unrecorded. Harbour depths were estimated rather than measured. The Great Lakes are geologically complicated, with shallow shelves dropping suddenly into deep basins, with reefs lurking just below the surface in waters that look perfectly safe from the wheelhouse. A captain navigating by compass and shoreline landmarks and the memory of previous passages was working without a margin of error that the lakes were not willing to provide. There was no systematic weather forecasting. There was no Coast Guard presence capable of reaching a vessel in distress. When the wind turned and the sky changed, a crew had whatever warning nature gave them and nothing more. The daily reality of life on a working lake vessel was a negotiation with that uncertainty, conducted from sunrise to sunset and through the night watches beyond. A captain began each day reading the water and the sky for signs that could not be trusted to hold. Deckhands worked in cramped holds with heavy cargoes that shifted in rough weather, securing loads with rope and instinct, breathing air that smelled of wet timber and bilge. Passengers, when there were passengers, understood that the passage came with risk that no one stated plainly but everyone recognized. The first recorded confirmation of how that risk resolved itself came in 1816, when a wooden schooner called the Invincible went down, entering the ledgers as the earliest documented shipwreck on the Great Lakes. She had been built in 1802, one of the earliest vessels purpose-built for this inland trade. Her loss left no dramatic account, no famous survivors, no monument. Just a name, a date, and water closing over the hull. It was the beginning of a list that would grow for the next 2 centuries and is still growing now. The list grew because the problems were structural, built into the trade itself long before any particular ship set out on any particular morning. Understanding why so many vessels went down requires sitting with the ordinary conditions of a 19th century lake voyage, the kind of trip that most sailors completed without incident, and that history therefore ignored entirely, except on the days it did not. Start with the charts. The survey work that should have underpinned safe navigation across the Great Lakes was decades behind the traffic those lakes were already handling. By 1882, when the United States Lake Survey produced what was then considered a reasonably comprehensive set of navigational charts, the collection ran to 76 sheets. 76 charts to cover some of the most geologically complex freshwater systems on the planet, waterways riddled with submerged rocky shelves, sandbars that migrated with seasonal current shifts, and reefs that sat just inches below a surface that gave no outward sign of the danger beneath. Many of those charts showed depths of 18 feet or less, in passages that working freighters were already threading with drafts that demanded considerably more water than that. A captain consulting the best available charts and following them faithfully could still find his hull grinding against a bottom that no published document had bothered to record. The wooden freighter Continental learned exactly that lesson on December 12, 1904. When she struck a hidden sandbar in the middle of a blinding snowstorm off the Wisconsin coast. She was not doing anything reckless. She was running a route she had run before, in conditions that experienced lake sailors accepted as routine, relying on charts that had told her the passage was clear. The sandbar said otherwise. She grounded hard, and when winter arrived with its ice, the ice finished what the sandbar had started, working at her hull through the frozen months until spring found only wreckage. The Continental story was not remarkable. It was representative, a version of events that repeated itself so often across the lakes that it barely warranted a line in the maritime newspapers of the time. Wooden hulls were the other half of the equation. The schooners and early steamers that carried the lake trade through most of the 19th century were built from timber that was abundant, affordable, and fundamentally unsuited to the punishment the lakes were capable of delivering. Wood expands and contracts with temperature. It weakens under repeated soaking and drying cycles. It rots from the inside in ways a captain cannot see until a plank gives way at exactly the wrong moment. A vessel that was seaworthy when she left port in May could be subtly compromised by the time November arrived. Her corked seams opening slightly, her frame softened by a season of hard use, her hold carrying the smell of decay that experienced sailors recognized but could rarely afford to act on if there was still money to be made and cargo to be moved. The loading practices made things worse. Open cargo arrangements, where grain or lumber was piled without adequate protection from water shipped over the deck, meant that a single heavy wave breaking across the bow could begin saturating a load that added hundreds of pounds of deadweight, while simultaneously reducing buoyancy. Wooden ships with no watertight compartmentalization had no fallback once water began entering a hold in quantity. And because the sailing season was defined by ice and commerce equally, captains and owners pushed the calendar in both directions, launching when the ice was barely gone and running until the ice was very nearly back, putting vessels into conditions that an earlier departure or a later return would have avoided entirely. Then there was the fog. Lake fog is a particular and consistent cruelty, thick enough in certain conditions to reduce visibility to a ship length or less, settling without warning over passages that were clear when the watch changed, swallowing lighthouses and coastlines and the lights of other vessels into an undifferentiated grey that gave nothing back. A captain in heavy fog was navigating by time and compass, and a feel for the ship's motion that lived somewhere between experience and intuition. And when that combination failed, it failed completely. There was no radio to call for guidance, no distress signal that could reach anyone useful, no Coast Guard cutter standing by a few miles away. Radio communication would not reach Great Lakes freighters until the early years of the 20th century, when Morse code stations began operating around 1910, and even then the coverage was partial and the equipment unreliable. Before that, the only communication available between a vessel in trouble and anyone on shore was whatever flags could be read through weather that rarely cooperated. Night travel added another layer of hazard that the lake trade could not simply choose to avoid. Schedules demanded continuous running, and continuous running meant navigating through darkness on waters that even experienced captains found different and treacherous after the sun went down. On the night of September 30th, 1850, the two-masted schooner Northwestern was making her way across the lake when a steamer's crew spotted a light in the distance and read it as a lighthouse marking safe passage. It was not a lighthouse. It was the Northwestern's masthead light, rocking gently with the motion of the hull in the darkness. The steamer held her course, trusting the identification her crew had made, and drove into the Northwestern with enough force to send her to the bottom. In the dark, a living vessel had been mistaken for a fixed point of land. The error was understandable. The result was not survivable. Sudden squalls were the variable that turned manageable situations into fatal ones. Great Lakes weather systems can organize and collapse with a speed that surprises even people who have spent decades watching them. A sky that looked threatening but stable at noon could be producing 40-knot winds by 2 in the afternoon, and a wooden schooner caught in open water with a full load and a small crew had limited options once conditions deteriorated past a certain point. Captains made constant small calculations about whether to run for shelter or push on, weighing the delay against the risk, and the mathematics worked often enough that the ones who got it wrong stood out only in hindsight. Most of the time the gamble paid. Most of the time is not the same as all of the time, and over decades of seasonal traffic the margin extracted its toll. What is difficult now, and what was impossible then, is knowing exactly how large that toll was. When a small wooden schooner went down in a squall 50 miles from the nearest settlement, with a crew of 5 or 6 men who left no survivors and no witnesses, the event might find its way into a newspaper paragraph weeks later, based on nothing more than the vessel failing to arrive at her destination. Or it might not find its way anywhere at all, disappearing from the record as completely as it disappeared from the water. The Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum estimates that roughly 6,000 ships have gone down across the 5 lakes, a number arrived at through systematic research and careful documentation. But maritime historians who have pressed deeper into the gaps argue that the actual count is well over 25,000, reflecting the reality that many early wooden vessels left no paper trail capable of surviving into the present. The difference between 6,000 and 25,000 is not a rounding error. It is a measure of all the ordinary voyages that went quietly wrong and left nothing behind except water and silence. That silence is part of what makes the early era of Great Lakes shipping so hard to fully see. The disasters that made the papers, the collisions and the famous storms and the vessels whose loss prompted official inquiries, those are recoverable. The rest, the small schooners and their unnamed crews, the routine passages that stopped being routine somewhere between one shore and the other, those are carried in water rather than archives. If silence and scattered records define the broad tragedy of the early lake trade, then Whitefish Point defines something more concentrated and more visible. Here the accumulated danger of the Great Lakes did not spread itself quietly across hundreds of miles of open water. It gathered at a single promontory on the southern shore of Lake Superior and announced itself repeatedly, generation after generation, until the place had a reputation that every working sailor on the lakes knew before he ever laid eyes on it. The geography explains everything and forgives nothing. Lake Superior is the largest of the 5 lakes by surface area, a body of water so vast that it generates its own weather systems, its own peculiar wave patterns, its own brand of cold that has nothing in common with the manageable chill of the smaller lakes to the south and east. When a vessel running east on Superior approaches the end of that long crossing, she must eventually round Whitefish Point, a slender arm of land that juts out into the lake and marks the only practical entrance to Whitefish Bay. There is no going around the problem, every ship heading for the Saint, Meuse River and the passage toward Lake Huron must make that turn, has always had to make that turn, and in making it passes directly through one of the most hydrologically violent corridors in the Great Lakes system. The shape of the lake itself is part of the mechanism. Superior's enormous open expanse allows wind to build waves across what sailors call fetch, the uninterrupted distance over which a storm can organise its energy before it reaches a shoreline. By the time a northwest gale has crossed several hundred miles of open Superior water, the waves it produces are not the kind of thing that any lake sailor romanticizes. They are steep, closely spaced, and powerful in a way that is structurally different from ocean swells, which tend to be longer and more rhythmic. Lake waves hit hard and fast and from multiple directions when the geometry shifts, and a vessel caught broadside to them in heavy weather is in immediate conversation with disaster. What makes Whitefish Point especially treacherous is that the 80 miles of coastline stretching westward from the point offers absolutely nothing in the way of shelter. No natural harbours, no protected bays, no anchorages where a captain in deteriorating weather could hold his vessel while a storm passed. The cliffs and beaches along that stretch are a lee shore in the worst sense, meaning the wind pushes toward land rather than away from it, and a ship that loses power or loses headway in a northwest blow has very little room before the lake removes the question of what to do next. Mariners sailing that coast in the 19th century were essentially committed once they left the shelter of Whitefish Bay behind. There was no turning back without risking the very exposure they were trying to escape, and there was no going forward without accepting that the point ahead was going to test everything the ship and crew could offer. The fog added a separate dimension of danger that the geography alone does not capture. Whitefish Point is notorious for sudden banks of fog that develop without warning, particularly in the transition seasons when warm air moves over the lake's cold surface water and the resulting condensation can reduce visibility to nearly nothing within minutes. A ship navigating by dead reckoning in that fog, working her way toward the turning point by time and compass, and a captain's accumulated memory of the passage, might find the shoals extending from the point before she found the point itself. The lighthouse established there in 1849, one of the oldest active lighthouses on Lake Superior, was built precisely because the navigation problem was obvious to anyone who looked at a chart and understood what the Cape's geometry meant for traffic. But a lighthouse visible in clear weather becomes invisible in dense fog, and there were seasons when the light offered little more than a psychological comfort to men who could not actually see it. Sailors learned about Whitefish Point the way they learned about most dangerous places in the pre-radio era, through stories that circulated in port towns, through warnings passed from experienced hands to younger ones on the docks, through the sight of wreckage that occasionally drifted ashore to remind anyone watching that the lake was not finished collecting its toll. The stretch earned its name, the graveyard of the Great Lakes, not from any single catastrophic event but from the steady accumulation of losses that the point extracted across decades of continuous traffic. A name like that does not attach itself to a place because of one bad storm. It attaches because the place repeatedly demonstrated that it would take ships when the conditions aligned, and because conditions aligned there with unsettling frequency. The count of vessels associated with this stretch of coastline runs, by the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum's careful estimate, to at least 240 ships lost between 1816 and 1975. That figure deserves a moment of consideration. 240 vessels, each one a working ship with a crew, a cargo, a home port, and a captain who made a series of decisions that ended at the bottom of Lake Superior, somewhere in the vicinity of that relentless point. The number spans the entire arc of Great Lakes maritime history, from the age of wooden schooners navigating by instinct and incomplete charts, all the way to the era of steel freighters carrying iron ore for the furnaces of a modernizing continent. The point was indifferent to what the ships were made of. The geometry and the weather were older than any of them. What those 240 losses represent in terms of human cost is harder to calculate precisely, because the same gaps in the record that obscure the broader lake totals apply here as well. Early losses often went undocumented in any systematic way. Crew lists from small commercial schooners in the mid-19th century were rarely comprehensive, and a vessel lost with all hands meant that no one came home to tell anyone what the crew had numbered. The lake kept those details along with everything else, Mariners who survived transits of that coastline did not necessarily speak of their relief in ways that made it into the record either, but the ones who went to the bottom left something behind, not always documentation, but wreckage, memory, and eventually the institutional impulse to mark and preserve what could not be undone. The Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum at Whitefish Point stands now as both a monument to the losses and a practical act of remembrance, its exhibits tracing individual ships and individual crews across the full span of the region's maritime history. The Whitefish Point Underwater Preserve protects the wreck sites from disturbance, while making them accessible to divers who want to understand the scale of what that coastline demanded. Modern sonar surveys continue to locate vessels that spent decades undiscovered on the lake floor, adding to the count and restoring names and stories to ships that had vanished without resolution. The point itself has not changed. It still protrudes into the same cold water, the wind still builds across the same enormous fetch, and the same geometry that created the choke point for 19th century schooners still concentrates traffic today. What has changed is the understanding, accumulated across generations of hard experience, that certain places in the natural world collect risk the way low points collect water, and that Whitefish Point has always been that kind of place. The ships that rest on the bottom there are not each other's company in any meaningful sense, but they are evidence of the same lesson, written in iron and timber across the floor of the deepest of the Great Lakes, waiting for anyone willing to go down and read it. Superior kept its dead in deep cold water and extracted them one by one from the traffic passing Whitefish Point. The accounting there was grim and concentrated, a single geographic choke point doing its deadly work across nearly 2 centuries. But if Superior was the lake that killed dramatically, that announced its violence through storms of legendary proportion and held its wrecks in famous named places, then Lake Michigan was the lake that simply accumulated, quietly and relentlessly, until the bottom of it held more lost ships than any other body of water in the entire system. The reasons for that concentration are not mysterious once you understand what Lake Michigan was asked to do and where it was asked to do it. Begin with geography. Michigan is the only Great Lake oriented north to south rather than roughly east to west, and that orientation has consequences that go beyond cartography. A lake running north-south is aligned to funnel the prevailing winds of the continent straight down its length. When a storm system pushes out of the north in November or swings up from the southwest in spring, the lake offers no angles, no shelter, no geometry that breaks the wind's momentum before it has built itself into something that can destroy a ship. The fetch on Lake Michigan can run to more than 300 miles, enough distance for a gale to organize waves that hit a vessel, not as a single rolling force, but as a repeating percussion, with very little time between impacts. Sailors who worked both Lake Superior and Lake Michigan sometimes said that Superior was more dangerous, but Michigan was more punishing, because the wave patterns on the longer north-south lake created a kind of chaotic chop that was structurally exhausting for wooden hulls long before it became immediately fatal. Then add the shoreline itself, which complicated every transit the lake demanded. The eastern shore of Michigan is lined with reefs and shoals in places, shallow water extending well out from land in ways that old charts rendered imprecisely, if they rendered them at all. The Manitou Passage, that narrow corridor between the Manitou Islands and the Michigan mainland on the eastern shore of the northern lake, earned its own accumulation of wrecks simply because it was where captains went looking for shelter when the open lake became untenable. Shelter in a narrow passage with a rocky bottom and shifting winds is sometimes no shelter at all. Ships that entered the Manitou Passage seeking refuge found instead that the geography had channeled the wind in new directions, set unexpected currents against their hulls, and placed them in proximity to shoals they had not anticipated. The passage solved one problem and introduced another, and the lake floor beneath it holds the record of that bargain. But geography alone does not explain why Michigan's bottom grew so crowded. The more fundamental answer is traffic, and the kind of traffic that came with building a continent. Chicago sat at the southern end of Lake Michigan, and by the middle of the 19th century had become one of the most consequential commercial cities in North America. The rail lines that converged there connected the agricultural interior of the continent to the eastern markets. But before those lines extended far enough to carry everything, the lake was the highway. Lumber came down from the forests of northern Michigan and Wisconsin in quantities that reshaped the skyline of every growing city in the region. Grain moved south from the farm counties of Wisconsin and Illinois toward Chicago's elevators, which were among the largest grain storage facilities on Earth at their peak. As the steel industry developed, iron ore moved through the system from the mining regions of the Upper Peninsula, and coal moved north to fuel the furnaces. Green Bay, Milwaukee, and a dozen smaller ports fed into this circulation, and the volume of vessels on the lake during the commercial season built year by year until the lake was not quiet for a single navigable month. That pressure had its own logic of risk. More ships meant more collisions in fog, which could settle onto the lake with almost no warning and reduce visibility to a length shorter than a ship itself. A heavily laden lumber schooner moving south at night in thick fog and a steam packet moving north on the same heading occupied the same water at the same moment, often enough that collisions of that kind became a recognizable pattern. Not unusual accidents, but recurring events with recognizable causes that the industry sometimes addressed and sometimes simply absorbed as the cost of doing business at the pace it demanded. The ships lost to those collisions were not all recorded with equal care. A schooner that went down quickly in deep water with its crew might leave behind only an absence, a vessel that did not arrive, a family that waited at a dock that eventually stopped expecting anyone. The seasonal pressure intensified all of this. The navigable season on Lake Michigan ran from roughly April to December in the 19th century, and captains felt the compression of that window acutely. A cargo not moved before the ice closed, the lake was a cargo that generated no income until the following spring, and the economics of the trade pushed vessels onto the water in the shoulder seasons when the weather was most unpredictable. The storms of October and November were known killers. Every experienced lakeman understood that the gales of the late autumn were different from the summer weather, longer in duration, lower in temperature, more likely to produce the kind of conditions where a ship that shipped water could not pump fast enough to survive. Yet the cargoes needed to move, and the economic logic was often stronger than the meteorological one, and so the autumn sailing season on Lake Michigan consumed vessels in a pattern that repeated itself with such consistency that it ceased to surprise anyone who worked the trade. What makes the broad account so difficult is the same problem the entire Great Lakes system presents, only multiplied. Lake Michigan's wrecks include the formally documented losses that made newspapers and harbour records, the vessels whose names appear in the formal tallies that give the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum its conservative estimate of around 6,000 wrecks for the whole system. But they also include the smaller commercial vessels, the fishing boats, the scows and tugs and unnamed working craft that move through the lake's commercial economy, without generating the kind of paperwork that survives. Historian Mark Thompson's suggestion that the true total across all 5 lakes is well over 25,000 wrecks is not a figure that surprises anyone who has spent time with the regional records and noticed how much simply falls through the gaps. For Lake Michigan specifically, the documented losses represent something like an audit of the lake's violence, comprehensive in some periods and in some vessel classes, and almost entirely silent in others. What is not silent is the lake bottom itself, which modern sonar has been exploring with increasing resolution, and which continues to return results that revise the counts upward every few years. Wrecks that spent a century undiscovered in 100 feet of water are not mysteries once the technology passes over them. They are simply evidence of losses that the paperwork never fully captured, ships and crews that the historical record filed under absence, and the lake filed under its flaw. Lake Michigan's crowded bottom is not a metaphor. It is a geographic fact, the physical residue of a commercial system that used the lake as hard as it could for as long as it could, and paid for that use in wood and iron and the lives of the people who worked the trade. The lake bottom, then, is the ledger, and the entries in it were made by many hands, many causes, many kinds of misfortune, accumulated across 2 centuries of hard commercial sailing. But if you were to sort through every loss recorded in that ledger, looking for the single cause that appears most often, that threads its way through the most names and the most dates and the most terrible outcomes, you would arrive at the same answer every time: weather. Not weather in the abstract, not as a general background condition, but weather as an active force capable of transforming a navigable lake into something that bore no relationship to the water a captain had departed from 12 hours earlier. Understanding why Great Lakes storms were so consistently lethal requires setting aside any comparison to ocean sailing, because the comparison misleads more than it helps. Ocean sailors understood violent weather as a thing that announced itself across distance, that gave a vessel time to read the horizon and adjust, that arrived in a sequence a skilled crew could recognize and respond to. The scale of the open ocean meant that a storm's worst energy was spread across a geography so vast that waves, though enormous, tended to have a long rolling period between crests, a rhythm a well-handled ship could work with rather than against. A sailor who understood the ocean understood that a wave was not simply a wall of water but a shape with a predictable interval, and that interval was often survivable. The Great Lakes offered no such interval. What the lakes produced instead was a function of their geometry, that same fetch, that same unobstructed distance across enclosed water, that built waves with tremendous height but a short, steep period between crests. On Lake Superior or Lake Michigan during a full November gale, waves could reach 35 feet and arrive in rapid succession, giving a vessel almost no time to climb one crest before the next was already rising beneath the bow. The result was not a rhythmic contest between ship and sea, but something closer to percussion, a relentless hammering that worked against hull seams, against deck fittings, against the structural logic of a vessel designed to flex and bend within certain tolerances that the lake on its worst days simply exceeded. And in extreme conditions the wave patterns could cross and interfere with one another, producing rogue-type waves that climbed well above even the general storm height, arriving without warning from unexpected angles, without the courtesy of interval or pattern. Then there was the cold, which was not merely uncomfortable but transformative. In late autumn, water temperatures on the lakes dropped fast enough that a man who went overboard might lose functional use of his limbs within minutes. But the cold worked on ships themselves in a more insidious way. When temperatures fell far enough and spray was constant, it froze on every surface it touched. On decks, on rigging, on the rails and cabin structures, ice accumulated with each passing wave and each gust of wind-driven spray, adding weight in places where weight had not been designed to sit. A ship that had departed port with careful attention to its load distribution could find, hours into a storm, that hundreds of pounds of ice had built up on its upper works, raising its centre of gravity, altering its response to wave action, making it slower to right itself after each roll. The process was gradual enough that no single moment announced the danger, and sudden enough that by the time the problem was obvious, it was sometimes too late to address it. Freezing spray was not a dramatic killer, it was a patient one. Fog operated differently but with equal indifference to the people it caught. On the Great Lakes, fog could arrive without the meteorological prelude that ocean sailors associated with changing visibility. It could settle onto a lake surface that had been clear an hour before, dense enough to reduce visibility to a ship's length or less, thick enough to muffle the sound of a steam whistle until it was nearly too late to matter. The consequences played out in the collision records with a regularity that became almost routine. Vessels moving at speed through conditions where speed was genuinely dangerous. Captains making a calculation that the fog would lift, that their position was sound, that the risk was acceptable because the schedule demanded it. The wreck of the John B. Cowell in 1909, lost in dense fog off Whitefish Point in a collision attributed directly to excessive speed and failure to signal, resulted in the suspension of both captains for 30 days. The penalty acknowledged the human error. It could not acknowledge the vessel or the men who went down with it. Which brings the story to what may be the most consistent thread running through all these losses, the thread that is not a natural force at all, but an economic one. Captains on the Great Lakes worked within a system that applied constant pressure toward departure and against delay. Cargo owners and shipping companies measured profitability in transits completed, in cargoes delivered before the season closed, in the difference between arriving on schedule and arriving late to a market that had already moved. Insurance arrangements sometimes required a formal gale warning before a captain was covered for losses sustained in storm conditions, which created a perverse incentive. Sailing before the warning was issued could mean sailing without coverage, but waiting for the warning meant losing time, losing position in a competitive system where other captains might be willing to go. The forecasting tools available to those captains were, by modern standards, nearly useless for the conditions the lakes could produce. The Weather Bureau of the early 20th century understood broad storm patterns, but could not predict with useful precision the speed at which a Great Lakes storm might intensify, the local effects of lake temperature on atmospheric behaviour, or the way that two converging storm systems might interact over enclosed water to produce something neither system would have generated alone. A forecast that said winds freshening from the northwest did not prepare anyone for what freshening from the northwest could mean when the conditions were precisely wrong, when the atmospheric pressure was dropping at a rate the instruments registered only after the fact, when a gale that began as a navigational inconvenience became, within a matter of hours, something without a peacetime name. Experienced lakemen knew the signs in their bodies before they knew them in the instruments: the colour of the western sky at sunset, the particular quality of the swell running ahead of a storm that was still below the horizon, the way the air smelled when a serious system was building. These were real skills, hard-earned and genuinely useful, and they saved vessels that the instruments and the forecasts had not warned. But they were skills calibrated to conditions the men had survived before, and the Great Lakes had a recurring capacity to produce conditions that exceeded what anyone had survived before, that arrived at a scale or a speed or a combination of factors that put the experience of even the most seasoned captain outside the range, where experience was sufficient. All of this was in the background when November of 1913 arrived. The patterns were familiar, the pressures were familiar, the inadequacy of the forecasts was familiar. What was not familiar was the scale at which the lake was about to demonstrate everything that it was capable of. The storm that came that November was not unusual in its origins. It was unusual in its execution, in the precise and terrible way that every dangerous quality of Great Lakes weather assembled itself simultaneously over a system of ships that had been sailing under schedule pressure into a forecast that the Weather Bureau had already gotten wrong. What followed would rewrite permanently the way anyone who worked the lakes understood what the word storm could mean. It came together in the first week of November 1913, the way the worst Great Lakes storms always came together, quietly at first, in ways that the instruments of the era could detect but not adequately interpret. Two separate low-pressure systems were tracking across the continent, each dangerous enough on its own terms, each capable of generating conditions that would have kept a careful captain in port. What the Weather Bureau could not foresee, and what the captain sailing that weekend could not know, was that the two systems were on a path toward each other, that they would merge over the warm inland water of the Great Lakes, and deepen into something the meteorological vocabulary of 1913 had no adequate word for. The central pressure of the combined system would eventually fall to 968.5 millibars, a number that, even today, is associated with systems of extraordinary violence. On the Great Lakes in November, surrounded by water that had not yet given up its summer warmth, it produced conditions that observers would spend the rest of their lives struggling to describe. By November 7th, the storm was building across all four of the affected lakes simultaneously. The winds reached hurricane force, recorded at speeds up to 90 miles an hour at some observation points, though the winds themselves were not the most terrifying element. What the winds produced on the open water of Lake Huron, Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, and Lake Erie was a sea state that simply should not have been possible in an enclosed body of water. Waves climbed to heights that experienced lakemen refused to report for fear of not being believed. Later analysis, including modern hydrodynamic simulations of the event, confirmed wave heights approaching 38 feet as a sustained condition, with rogue waves crossing and reinforcing each other to reach crests near 50 feet. Not rolling ocean swells with the long intervals a ship could work with, but steep, short-period walls of fresh water rising and collapsing in rapid succession, sometimes arriving from conflicting angles when the wind shifted abruptly, as it did repeatedly throughout the storm's 4-day duration. The snow that came with the wind reduced visibility to nothing, whiting out the horizon, burying compass cards under ice, making it impossible for crews to see more than a few feet beyond the rail. Men who survived called it a white hurricane, and the name carried. By the time the storm exhausted itself on November 10th, 19 ships had been sunk outright, Another 19 were driven aground or stranded, their hulls broken or their machinery disabled beyond any capacity to help themselves. More than 250 people were dead. Some sources would later count higher. The precise number was difficult to establish because some of the ships went down so completely, so quickly, that there were no survivors to report what had happened and no witnesses to record the final minutes. They were simply present at one point in the shipping records and absent from every record afterward. Their crews filed under missing and never adequately accounted for. The Charles S. Price was among the most haunting of these disappearances. She was a bulk freighter, 524 feet long, built of steel, crewed by 28 men. She had departed in the days before the storm with coal in her hold and every expectation of a routine late-season transit. When the storm passed, she was found floating upside down on Lake Huron, her hull exposed above the surface like the back of some enormous dead animal. No visible damage to explain how she'd capsized, no survivors to provide an account. For days she simply drifted, unidentified, because no one who saw her had seen a ship in that configuration before and could not initially determine which vessel she was. When divers eventually confirmed her identity, the discovery only deepened the mystery, because a 500-foot steel ship does not capsize without a story, and the storm had taken every man who knew it. The LC. Waldo offered a different kind of account, one where some of the crew survived to describe what they had endured. Caught in the open water of Lake Superior, her crew reported a rogue wave of a height they estimated at 50 feet, striking the vessel without warning from an angle the ship had no time to meet. The wave drove the Waldo ashore on Gull Island, where she came to rest in pieces, her hull broken, her structure violated in ways that spoke to the sheer mechanical force of what had hit her. That some of her crew survived was a function of how close to shore they had been driven, near enough that rescue was possible once the storm began to ease, near enough to shore to tell the story. What made the 1913 disaster so devastating beyond its immediate toll was the accumulation of failures that had allowed so many vessels to be caught simultaneously. The Weather Bureau had issued warnings before the storm arrived, but the warnings described conditions that, while serious, did not capture what the merged systems were going to produce. Captains who had sailed through November gales before made reasonable judgments based on unreasonable information. The forecasting language of the era used the word storm in a way that covered too wide a range of conditions, from the merely dangerous to the unsurvivable, without a vocabulary that clearly distinguished between them. After 1913, the Weather Bureau acknowledged the failure and pledged to develop higher category warnings for events that exceeded ordinary gale conditions, an acknowledgement that the existing system had not been built to handle what the Great Lakes were capable of generating. The ship designs contributed to the losses in ways that the aftermath slowly made clear. Many of the vessels caught in the storm featured what was known as the straight deck configuration, a hull design that maximized cargo capacity but left hatch covers relatively exposed along the deck, secured against weather that experienced sailors considered severe but not against conditions that went beyond severe into something structurally overwhelming. A wave of sufficient height and force, arriving at the right angle on a vessel already stressed by hours of continuous punishment, could compromise hatch covers that had been designed and inspected to what the industry considered an adequate standard. Once water entered the cargo hold in quantity, a ship's stability changed rapidly. The process that followed could be measured not in hours but in minutes. The storm entered public memory immediately and permanently. Newspapers called it the White Hurricane. Shipping families across the Great Lakes region spent weeks waiting for lists that confirmed what they already feared. The surviving captains gave accounts that circulated widely, accounts of waves they had never seen before, of barometric drops that their instruments could barely track, of the specific quality of helplessness that came from finding, in the middle of a lake in a blizzard, that everything they knew about weather and seamanship had reached its limit. For decades afterward, the storm of 1913 was the reference point by which every other Great Lakes storm was measured. When conditions began to resemble that November in some meteorological way, the comparison was made explicitly, in harbour masters' offices and wheelhouses, and in the conversations of men who worked the water and understood what the comparison meant. It shaped the culture of caution that ran through Great Lakes shipping for generations, a culture that acknowledged, at least in principle, that the lakes could produce something beyond the range of reasonable preparation. It did not end the losses. The economic pressures that had filled the lakes with ships in the first place were not altered by a storm, however catastrophic. But it established, in the collective memory of everyone connected to the lakes, a baseline for what the worst looked like. It would take more than 60 years and one more famous name before that baseline would be seriously tested again. The years after 1913 brought change to the Great Lakes fleet, the way change always comes to industries shaped by catastrophe and commerce simultaneously, incompletely, unevenly, with one eye on what had just gone wrong and the other on the ledger. Ships got larger, hulls got stronger, engines got more powerful, and the cargoes they carried swelled in volume and economic value until the trade moving across these 5 inland seas represented a weight of national industry that was difficult to fully comprehend from the shore. The transformation had actually begun earlier than 1913, rooted in a single vessel that changed the calculus of what a Great Lakes freighter could be. When the SS Onoko slid into the water in 1882, she was something genuinely new. The first true iron-hulled bulk freighter, designed specifically for the Great Lakes trade, built to carry iron ore and coal and limestone in quantities that wooden ships could never approach. She was proof of concept for an entire industrial logic. Steel and iron hulls could be built longer, loaded heavier, and driven harder than anything wood could offer. They did not rot. They did not work apart at the seams in heavy weather, the way planked hulls sometimes did. They gave owners and captains a sense, reasonable enough on the surface, that the fundamental relationship between ship and lake had shifted in the ship's favour. Over the following decades, that sense deepened as the fleet grew and the vessels grew with it. By the early 20th century, Great Lakes freighters were reaching length that would have seemed fantastical to the men who had sailed wooden schooners through the same passages a generation before. 500 feet, 550, 600. These were not ships in any dimension that the old lakemen would have recognised. They were floating industrial infrastructure, purpose-built to move the raw materials of American manufacturing from the mines of the upper lakes to the furnaces of the industrial cities, and to do it continuously, season after season, with the reliability that a steel economy demanded. By 2002, the lakes were moving approximately 162 million net tons of dry bulk cargo in a single year, a number that speaks not to shipping as a feature of the regional economy, but as one of its central mechanisms. Iron ore coming down from the ranges of Minnesota and Michigan, coal moving in the opposite direction, grain from the prairie ports, limestone for the furnaces. The lakes were not a picturesque backdrop to the industrial Midwest. They were its circulatory system, and yet the water underneath all that tonnage remained exactly what it had always been. The same geometries that made Lake Huron and Lake Superior so dangerous in November 1913 were present the following November and every November after. The fetch had not shortened. The pressure systems that formed over the continent and deepened over warm lake water had not learned to respect the new size of the ships passing beneath them. The cold came on the same schedule. The ice returned each winter with the same indifference to the shipping season's needs. What had changed was the scale of what the lakes could take when something went wrong. The size of the vessel, the size of the crew, the size of the cargo, and the economic aftermath of a loss. What had not changed was the fundamental equation between weather and water on one side and steel and human judgment on the other. Steel, it turned out, had its own vulnerabilities, ones that were not immediately obvious from the deck of a well-maintained vessel moving through calm water on a clear autumn morning. The metallurgy of early 20th century shipbuilding produced steel that was strong under the conditions for which it had been tested, but which behaved differently under the combined stresses of extreme cold, heavy wave action and the specific bending force known as hogging. The tendency of a long vessel working through wave sequences to flex along its length in ways that put enormous tension on the hull's middle section. These stresses accumulated over years of heavy use. They interacted with repairs that, however competent, introduced changes in the metal's behaviour at the points where old steel met new, and they could, under the right conditions of temperature and storm severity, propagate through a hull with a speed that left crews no time to understand what was happening before the ship had already made its decision. This was not a theoretical concern. It was what the investigations would eventually conclude about two of the most consequential losses of the mid-20th century, ships that were modern by every measure their era recognized, vessels that should have been adequate to the water they sailed on and were not. The Schaldie Bradley, at 639 feet, one of the largest vessels on the lakes, and known in the industry as the Queen of the Lakes, sank in Lake Michigan in November 1958. The official investigation placed the cause at structural failure, specifically the propagation of cracks through steel that had become brittle under years of stress and the specific conditions of that November night. She had been heavily used, she had been repaired, she had been considered sound. She broke apart anyway, in water that the lakes had every historical right to produce in November, and 33 men went down with her. 8 years later, in 1966, the Daniel J. Morrell offered a nearly identical testimony. She was 603 feet, built before the metallurgical standards of the post-war era had been applied to Great Lakes construction, and when 70-mile-an-hour winds drove 20-foot waves across Lake Huron in late November, her hull cracked and then opened completely, splitting the ship into two sections that sank separately. The investigation again pointed to brittle steel, to the particular failure mode of pre-1948 construction under conditions that exceeded the tolerances built into hulls designed for a slightly different understanding of what the lakes could do. Of the 29 men aboard, 28 died. The single survivor spent hours in the water before rescue, and his account of hearing and feeling the ship break apart beneath him became one of the most precise and terrible documents in the literature of Great Lakes disaster. What connected these losses to everything that had come before them was not simply the cause, but the pattern. New ships, or ships that had seemed new enough, caught in weather the lakes had always been capable of generating, with crews and companies that had perhaps absorbed enough confidence from the scale and modernity of their vessels to underestimate the residual risk. The 1913 storm had taught that wooden ships and open-deck configurations were not adequate to extreme conditions. The lesson had been partially learned and partially converted into a different kind of confidence, a confidence in steel and size that turned out to be its own form of underestimation. Each generation of Great Lakes shipping inherited the water unchanged and the warning slightly reworded, and each generation discovered, eventually and at cost, that the reworded warnings covered much of the same ground. The losses of the Bradley and the Morrell were not the end of this pattern. They were its continuation, evidence that the interval between major disasters could be long enough to allow the memory of the last one to soften into institutional background noise, into a history that was acknowledged and not fully absorbed. Between those two sinkings and the next famous name, another decade would pass. The bulk cargo trade would continue to grow, the ships would grow with it, and somewhere in that growth, in the confidence that comes from moving 162 million tons of cargo across cold water without incident year after year, the lake was quietly accumulating the conditions for one more proof of what it had always known, and the fleet kept having to relearn. The Schaldie Bradley had a name that sounded like it belonged to a man who wore a suit and sat behind a desk in a company office somewhere, which in a sense it did. She'd been named after the president of the Michigan Limestone and Chemical Company, launched in 1927 at a time when the Great Lakes fleet was pushing the boundaries of what bulk freighters could be in both length and ambition. At 639 feet, she was for a time the longest vessel on the lakes, and the industry gave her the title Queen of the Lakes with the kind of easy confidence that comes from owning the biggest thing in the room. She carried limestone, primarily hauling it from the quarries at Calcite near Rogers City, Michigan, down the length of Lake Michigan to the industrial ports where steel mills and construction projects consumed it in enormous quantities. She was a working ship, unremarkable in her daily routine, which is precisely what made her so central to the lives of the men who crewed her and the town that supplied most of them. Rogers City was not a large place. In 1958, its population sat around 3,900 people, a small Michigan town shaped almost entirely by the limestone trade, where the calcite quarry was not just an employer, but the organizing fact of the local economy and the local social world. The men who worked the boats knew each other. Their wives knew each other. Their children grew up together. When a vessel left the dock at Calcite, there were families ashore who knew the name of every man aboard and roughly when to expect them back. On November 17, 1958, the Carl D. Bradley finished loading at Calcite and headed south on Lake Michigan toward Manitowoc, Wisconsin, running light after delivering her cargo, the hull riding higher in the water than it would under a full load. The weather was building. A gale had been forecast, and the forecasts were not wrong. Through the afternoon, two weather systems merged over the lake and the winds climbed, southwest gusts eventually reaching somewhere between 43 and 56 knots, driving waves that by early evening were building into the kind of sharp, closely spaced swells that Lake Michigan generates when wind and water have enough room to develop momentum. Captain Roland Bryan held his course. The ship had sailed through bad weather before. She was steel and she was large, and the calculation that had guided Great Lakes captains through storms for decades was the same one guiding him now. At approximately 5:35 in the afternoon, the men below heard a sound that witnesses would later describe only as a thud, a single percussive event that should not have been there, that did not belong to any normal inventory of ship sounds. Moments later, the vessel began to break. The hull cracked somewhere amidships and the crack propagated, as cracks in brittle steel under load do not gradually but suddenly. The failure travelling through the metal faster than comprehension could keep pace with. The Carl D. Bradley buckled along her length in the particular catastrophic way that investigators would later identify as the result of hogging stress interacting with steel that had grown notch-sensitive and brittle over 31 years of heavy use. Within minutes, the ship that had been called the Queen of the Lakes was two separate pieces, each sinking independently into water that was dark and cold and violent, and offered almost nothing in the way of survival. There were 35 men aboard. They had perhaps no more than a few minutes to act, in conditions that made any action enormously difficult. 2 lifeboats were launched or attempted. A life raft floated clear of the wreck. Of all the crew, only 2 men reached that raft and stayed with it long enough to be rescued. First mate Elmer Fleming and deck watchman. Frank Mays clung to the raft through the night, through seas that repeatedly swept it and them into the cold water, through 15 hours that tested whatever boundary exists between endurance and its failure. The Coast Guard cutters Sundew and Hollyhock arrived after dark, hours after the sinking, working through weather that limited their own ability to search effectively. They found Fleming and Mays alive. They found 17 bodies in the days that followed. The other 33 men from the Carl D. Bradley, including Captain Bryan, did not come home. In Rogers City, the news arrived the way devastating news arrives in small places, unevenly at first, and then all at once. 23 of the 35 men aboard were from the town. 23 women became widows. 53 children lost their fathers. The mass funeral that followed was held in a town small enough that almost no one present was more than 1 degree of separation from the grief being observed. The mayor proclaimed November 18th a day of remembrance. Later, a memorial park would be dedicated at the water's edge, and the ship's bell would be installed there as a permanent marker of what the lake had taken. These are the kinds of memorials that communities build when the loss is too large to absorb privately, when it belongs not to individual families, but to the whole place in a way that requires a public form of acknowledgement. What the investigation eventually concluded was not surprising in the way disasters sometimes are. The US Coast Guard Marine Board pointed to undetected structural weakness, or defect, as the cause, specifically the behaviour of aging steel under the combined stresses of storm conditions and the flexing of a long hull working through heavy wave sequences. The Bradley's steel was of a type that had been entirely acceptable by the standards under which she was built in 1927. Those standards had not fully accounted for what decades of heavy use and the accumulation of microscopic damage would do to a hull's ability to resist the propagating failure of a crack under load. She had been inspected. She had been repaired. The repairs themselves may have introduced some of the conditions that made failure more likely. The interaction between old and new steel never quite as seamless as it appears. She had been considered sound by every measure that the inspection framework of her era provided, and yet the framework was not measuring the right things. The reforms that followed were meaningful. Mandatory second life raft were required. Lifeboat release gear was improved. The National Transportation Safety Board would later push for structural renewal standards targeting pre-1948 freighters specifically, the class of vessel whose construction predated the metallurgical improvements that came with post-war shipbuilding. These were not small changes. They saved lives in subsequent years, quietly and without the documentation that disasters generate, the prevented catastrophes that never make headlines. But what the Bradley's loss made visible, for those who were paying attention, was something that went beyond any specific regulation. It revealed how confidence in steel had become its own form of assumption, how the size and the modernity and the industrial scale of the mid-century fleet had created a collective sense that the fundamental problems of Great Lakes navigation had been largely solved, that what remained was management rather than vulnerability. The lake had answered that assumption before in 1913 with wooden ships. It answered it again in 1958 with steel. The water did not distinguish between the two. It applied the same forces to both and waited to see what the material would do under pressure it had accumulated slowly and expressed all at once. Rogers City knew the answer. The families who stood at that memorial park above Lake Huron knew it, and the fleet, which went on sailing the following season and the one after that, carried the knowledge in the way institutions carry uncomfortable knowledge, officially in reports and regulations, and unofficially in the uneasy recognition that the lake had not finished making its point. The lake had not finished making its point. It would prove this 8 years later, on the same body of water, in the same late-season window, when the fleet pushed its luck against the calendar, with a ship old enough to carry the same metallurgical vulnerabilities that had doomed the Bradley and a crew whose last hours would be preserved in detail more vivid and more harrowing than almost any other disaster the Great Lakes had produced. The reason for that detail was simple and terrible. One man survived to describe it, the SS Daniel J. Morrell had been on the lake since 1906, a 603-foot steel bulk carrier built in an era when the ambitions of Great Lakes shipping were expanding faster than the engineering science needed to fully support them. She was a working ship in the plainer sense, 60 years old by the time of her final voyage, her hull carrying the accumulated history of every storm she'd ridden and every cargo she had hauled across the 4 lakes she knew. In late November of 1966 she was running light, in ballast only no cargo in the holds, on Lake Huron, with 29 men aboard and a season that was pressing toward its close. The date was November 29th. The weather was building. What developed that night over Lake Huron was not unusual by Great Lakes standards, which is part of what makes the story so instructive. This was not a once-in-a-generation storm on the scale of 1913. This was the kind of late autumn gale the lake produced regularly, winds climbing past 60 miles per hour and eventually exceeding 70, waves building to 20 or 25 feet with the particular steep choppiness that inland waters develop when there is enough fetch and enough fury. It was dangerous. It was serious. It was also the kind of weather that Great Lakes freighters had been sailing through for decades, the kind that captains weighed against schedule and season and the accumulated confidence of experience and generally decided to run. Aboard the Morrell, The crew felt the ship working through the swells in the way long hulls do, flexing along her length as the bow and stern alternately lifted and fell in wave sequences that were not synchronized to the ship's natural period of movement. This flexing is normal. It is engineered to a point. The question is always what lies on the other side of that point, and for the Morrell, on the night of November 29th, the answer came at approximately 2:15 in the morning. The hull fractured amidships. What followed happened fast, the way these failures always do once the crack begins to move through steel that no longer has the toughness to arrest it. The bow and stern became two separate vessels, the stern still powered by its own engine, which continued running for a time in the terrible indifference of machinery to the catastrophe it was no longer connected to. The bow section began to sink. The crew who had been below, sleeping, working, riding out the storm in the ordinary suspended state of men at sea in bad weather, suddenly had only minutes to act on a deck that was moving wrongly beneath them, in darkness, in cold that registered 34 degrees Fahrenheit in the water below. Most of them did not survive the next hour. Some jumped, some were swept. The lake was not offering conditions in which a man in the water lasted long. One life raft got free of the wreck and the men who were able reached it, dragging themselves aboard in a darkness broken only by what the storm allowed the sky to reveal. There were several men on the raft. One by one, through the hours that followed, the cold and the waves took them. By the time rescue arrived, 38 hours after the ship had broken apart, only one man remained alive. His name was Dennis Hale. He was 26 years old, a watchman aboard the Morrell, and what he endured between the ship's breaking and his rescue is the kind of account that survives not because it is dramatic in the way disaster stories are sometimes dramatized, but because it is relentlessly specific. He had been in his bunk when the hull fractured, and he came up onto the deck wearing boxer shorts, a life jacket, and a pea coat. Nothing else. No boots. No additional clothing against water that was a degree above freezing. He reached the life raft. He held on. Other men around him stopped holding on. The raft moved wherever the storm took it, across open water, through wave sequences that repeatedly swept it and soaked it and tested what remained of everyone who clung to it. 38 hours. One man. What the Coast Guard's investigation eventually concluded echoed, with painful familiarity, what had been said about the Carl D. Bradley 8 years before. The Morrell's hull had failed due to brittle steel, the same metallurgical problem that had been identified, studied, and the subject of recommended reforms after the Bradley sank. Ships built before 1948 had been constructed with steel that, over decades of stress cycles and cold temperatures, lost the ductility needed to resist crack propagation. When a fracture started, there was nothing in the material to stop it. The hull did not bend, it broke. The investigators recommended structural reinforcement or seasonal restrictions for older vessels exceeding 400 feet in length. They pointed to the Morrell's sister ship, the Edward Y. Townsend, which had survived the same storm with its own stress cracks, damage that made visible exactly how close other vessels of the same generation were running to the same threshold. These recommendations mattered. They moved regulations forward, but the Morrell's sinking also revealed something that regulation alone could not fully address, which was the gap between an institutional understanding of risk and the lived reality of a crew on a 60-year-old ship in a November storm on a lake that had been making the same argument about structural integrity since it first began swallowing steel freighters. The Bradley had made the argument. The Morrell repeated it with only slightly different details. Same lake, same season, same failure mode, same sudden transition from routine passage to catastrophe, with almost no interval between the two states. That interval is what haunts the Morrell story. The ship did not struggle toward her end over hours of escalating crisis. She broke. The crew moved from the ordinary managed danger of a heavy weather night to mortal emergency in the space of minutes, and what determined who lived was not preparedness or training or proximity to safety equipment in any meaningful sense. It was where a man happened to be on a raft as the hours accumulated, and whether his body could sustain what the water demanded of it. Dennis Hale's body could. His account of those 38 hours, the men around him going still, the cold becoming something beyond sensation, the raft drifting without direction or destination, is the kind of testimony that fixes a wreck in memory long after the investigation reports have been filed and the regulatory changes have been implemented. Some wrecks endure because of what they cost. Others endure because someone came back to describe them from the inside. The Morrell's place in the Great Lakes record belongs to both categories. A ship that confirmed what the Bradley had already suggested about aging steel and winter seasons, and a survivor whose account made the abstract mathematics of hull stress and fracture mechanics into something no one who heard it could easily set aside. The lake had spoken again in the same language, with the same cold patience, and the fleet was listening, or thought it was, for another 9 years, until a November evening in 1975, when a ship called the Edmund Fitzgerald left the harbour at Superior, Wisconsin, and began what would become the most famous last voyage in the history of the inland seas. She was the largest ship on the Great Lakes when she was launched in 1958, 729 feet of steel, capable of carrying more than 26,000 tons of cargo in a single load. A vessel that had spent 17 years moving iron ore and taconite between the ports of the Western Lakes and the steel mills that consumed them. Her name was the Edmund Fitzgerald, and in the world of Great Lakes shipping she was not an aging relic pushed past her limits, but a working flagship, well maintained and celebrated, the kind of ship that made the industry proud of what it had built. She had none of the metallurgical vulnerability of the Bradley or the Morrell. She was not running at the edge of obsolescence. She was, by any reasonable measure, exactly the kind of vessel you trusted to handle a November passage. On the morning of November 9th, 1975, the Fitzgerald departed Superior, Wisconsin, bound east through Lake Superior with a full load of taconite pellets destined for a steel mill near Detroit. Her captain was Ernest McSorley, a veteran of the lakes with decades of experience behind him. The weather forecast was serious. A storm system was developing, but not extraordinary by the standards of the season. McSorley and the captain of the nearby bulk carrier, Arthur M. Anderson, decided to run a northern route that would offer some shelter from the anticipated winds. The two ships would travel in loose company through what was coming. The Fitzgerald was the larger and faster vessel. The Anderson kept pace behind her, and for the first hours of the passage the plan seemed sound. What the storm became was something else. By the evening of November 10th, Lake Superior was no longer accepting the terms that forecasters had described. Wind gusts were reaching somewhere between 60 and 75 knots, depending on the source and the measuring point, and the wave heights were climbing toward 25 feet. Not the long rolling swells of an ocean in heavy weather, but the steep, closely spaced walls of water that Lake Superior builds when its limited fetch concentrates energy in a different way than the open sea. The Fitzgerald was running hard in front of it, making for Whitefish Bay and the relative shelter it offered, 17 miles to the south. The Anderson was watching her on radar. During the afternoon and early evening, McSorley had been in radio contact with the Anderson. His reports were measured, but they documented a ship under accumulating stress. The Fitzgerald had developed a list. She had lost radar. Vents had been damaged, possibly by water coming over the deck. McSorley asked the Anderson to assist with navigation since his own radar was out, and the Anderson tracked the Fitzgerald through the storm, while maintaining its own course through conditions that were, on the Anderson's deck, violent enough that the crew was struggling to function normally. The men on the Anderson knew the Fitzgerald was in trouble. They knew she was close. They could see her on the screen. At 7:10 in the evening, a radio operator on the Anderson spoke with McSorley one final time. The operator described the weather and asked how the Fitzgerald was managing. McSorley replied with the last words anyone ever heard him speak: "We are holding our own." When the Anderson's crew looked at their radar a short time later, the Fitzgerald was gone. Not moving slowly toward Whitefish Bay, not altering course, simply gone, removed from the screen without distress call, without any indication that something catastrophic had begun, between one radar sweep and the next. The lake had taken her in the interval between moments. All 29 men aboard died with her. The wreck was found the following year in 530 feet of water, 17 miles from the entrance to Whitefish Bay. 17 miles from the shelter McSorley had been running toward, close enough that the geometry of it remains one of the cruelest facts of the story. The hull lay in two main sections on the bottom of Lake Superior in Canadian waters, where the site is protected and diving is prohibited. The bow had driven into the lake bed with enough force to bury itself, suggesting a dive rather than a gradual flooding, a ship that went down fast and hard rather than slowly filling and settling. Why she sank is a question that has never been fully answered, and the absence of a certain answer is one of the things that keeps the Fitzgerald story alive in a way that ships with clearer post-mortems do not sustain. The official US Coast Guard investigation completed in 1977 pointed to improperly closed or damaged hatch covers as the most likely explanation. Water entering the cargo hold gradually during the storm, adding weight and reducing buoyancy until the ship's reserve of stability was exhausted. This conclusion was disputed almost immediately by the families of the crew, by marine engineers, and by the captain of the Anderson, who did not find it persuasive. Other theories accumulated over the years. Some investigators suggested the Fitzgerald may have struck a shoal near Caribou Island during the storm's peak, opening the hull to flooding from below. Others proposed that a rogue wave, or a sequence of waves of unusual height and timing, simply overwhelmed the deck and drove her under before McSorley or his crew had time to react. The hull's broken state is consistent with several of these scenarios and conclusive about none of them. The lake has not offered a definitive answer, and after nearly 50 years it seems unlikely to. What the lake did offer instead was something unexpected. A story that refused to stay inside the maritime community. Gordon Lightfoot's ballad appeared in 1976, the year after the sinking, a folk song built from the facts of the voyage with the kind of spare, accumulating weight that fixed the narrative in the imagination of anyone who heard it. The Fitzgerald was already known. She'd been a famous ship in life as well as in death. But the song moved her into a different register entirely, transforming a marine disaster into something that felt like legend while it was still recent enough to hurt. Lines about the gales of November and the witch of November coming stealing captured something true about the lake in that season, and the song reached audiences who had never seen Lake Superior, who had no connection to iron ore or bulk carriers or the Sioux Locks, and made them feel the loss of 29 men they had never heard of before. The Fitzgerald became a cultural touchstone in a way that the Bradley and the Morrell, for all the tragedy they carried, had not fully managed to become. Annual memorial services at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum at Whitefish Point ring the bell of the Fitzgerald's recovered pilot house bell 29 times, once for each man who did not come home. The museum itself sits within sight of the Graveyard Coast, that stretch of Whitefish Point that has drawn ships to their ends since before the first steam vessels entered the lakes. The Fitzgerald lies at the edge of that same geography, 17 miles from the point that mariners have sought as a refuge for 2 centuries, close enough to safety that the distance feels like an accusation. There is something about the Fitzgerald that concentrates everything the lakes have been teaching their sailors for as long as sailors have been listening. She was not an old ship. She had an experienced captain. She had the benefit of radio communication and radar and a companion vessel tracking her through the storm. She had all the advantages that the wooden schooner captains of the 19th century lacked, and she still vanished between one radar sweep and the next. 29 lives extinguished in a silence that ended without warning. The questions around her sinking are not simply unresolved in the technical sense. They are a reminder that Lake Superior has not agreed to be fully understood, that November on the inland seas remains a negotiation with something that does not always negotiate in good faith, and that the Graveyard Coast is named what it is because the lake keeps making the same point, in the same season, with the same cold patience it has always brought to the task. The lakes do not simply take ships and let the matter rest. They take ships, and then they take the memory of those ships and reshape it into something that outlives the facts. Somewhere in the interval between a vessel disappearing and the community on shore finding words for what happened, the legend begins. It begins in the dockside conversation, in the account passed from one watch to the next, in the letter written home by a sailor who cannot quite explain what he saw in the fog at 3 a.m. The Great Lakes have claimed something in the neighbourhood of 6,000 ships by the most conservative accounting, and the lives of perhaps 30,000 people across the span of centuries that shipping has moved through these waters. That scale of loss does not simply become history, it becomes atmosphere. The oldest ghost ship on the lakes has been haunting the same waters since 1679, which gives it more than 3 centuries of practice. Le Griffon was built on the orders of the French explorer René Robert Cavelier, known to history as La Salle, a vessel intended to open the upper lakes to the fur trade and extend the reach of New France into territory that no European merchant vessel had yet navigated. She was modest by the standards of later ships, 45 tons, 7 guns, a crew of a handful of men, but she was the first commercial sailing vessel to travel Lake Erie and the upper lakes, a genuine threshold crossing in the history of the region. La Salle sent her back east from Green Bay in September of that year, loaded with furs and crewed by men he trusted, and she was never seen again. No wreck was found, no survivors appeared, no debris washed ashore in any quantity sufficient to explain what happened to a vessel and everyone aboard her. For 3 centuries, the mystery has remained genuinely open. Searchers have proposed candidates over the years, fragments and timbers and anchors that might belong to Le Griffon, but none has achieved consensus, and the ship's final resting place remains unconfirmed. That persistent uncertainty is exactly the kind of condition in which legend thrives. Sailors on Lake Michigan and Lake Huron in the centuries after Le Griffon's disappearance reported seeing her, a low silhouette moving through early morning mist, a square-rigged shape in waters where no square rigger had any business sailing, there in one glance and gone in the next. She became the first ghost ship of the Great Lakes, the original Phantom, and the tradition she inaugurated would be claimed by dozens of vessels in the centuries that followed. The Bannockburn earned her legend on a specific date. She disappeared on Lake Superior on the 20th of November, 1902, last spotted by the crew of the passing steamer Algonquin, somewhere off the Keweenaw Peninsula, a large steel freighter moving normally through weather that was becoming difficult. The Algonquin's crew saw her clearly enough to identify her, and then she was simply not there. No distress call reached any shore station. No significant debris came to shore in the days that followed. The lake gave back almost nothing, and 22 men went with her into whatever happened between one sighting and the absolute silence that came after. What the Bannockburn became was the Flying Dutchman of Lake Superior, her name borrowed from the most ancient of all phantom ship traditions and applied to the lakes with the same intuitive logic that had been applied to Le Griffon before her. Sailors began reporting her apparition in the years after the sinking, her outline surfacing in storm conditions on Superior, always moving, always on a heading that led nowhere verifiable, always gone before anyone could be certain of what they had seen. The sightings were not documented the way a latitude and longitude gets documented. They lived in the oral record, in the accounts that circulated through the ports and the wheelhouses and the forecastles of the working lake fleet. Whether any individual mariner genuinely believed he had seen the Bannockburn is a question too intimate to answer from a distance. What is certain is that the story served a purpose beyond entertainment. The Western Reserve adds another layer to understanding why these legends take the shape they do. She broke in two on Lake Superior in August of 1892 during a storm that her builders had not anticipated her hull could survive, a steel ship failing in the way that steel ships were not supposed to fail, a reassurance withdrawn without warning. Of the 27 people aboard, only one survived, a wheelsman named Harry Stewart, who was pulled from the lake after hours in the water, the sole witness to what had happened. His survival was extraordinary. The deaths of the other 26 were the kind of sudden, total loss that leaves a community groping for explanation. In the aftermath, lake sailors began to speak of a phantom helmsman seen at the wheel of the Western Reserve's broken hull, still steering through the mist as though the storm had not ended and the ship had not gone down. The image has a particular quality, not a ghost drifting aimlessly, but one still working, still trying to bring the ship to safety. There is grief compressed into that image, and the refusal to accept that the effort simply stopped. This is what the legends are doing, at their core. They're processing something that straightforward mourning cannot fully accommodate. When a ship vanishes without trace, without wreckage, without a body returned to shore, The grief has no object to attach to, no ritual completion. The community on shore is left with an absence where a fact should be, a gap in the record where an explanation ought to sit. The ghost ship fills that gap with something manageable, not an answer exactly, but a presence. The Bannockburn is still out there. The Western Reserve's helmsman is still trying. Le Griffon is still moving through the morning mist. The loss is real, but the ship, in some form, continues. The sailors who told these stories were not, for the most part, men who confused oral tradition with sworn testimony. They understood the difference between a legend and a logbook entry. But the lakes created conditions in which the boundary between observed fact and inherited story became genuinely difficult to navigate. Fog on Lake Superior in November reduces visibility to a few yards. Lights appear and disappear on the water, with explanations that are perfectly mundane in daylight and considerably less obvious at 4 a.m. in deteriorating weather. A vessel seen at distance and then not seen is a common enough event with perfectly ordinary causes, but when you know the Bannockburn was last reported in this same stretch of water and never accounted for, when you know the lake has kept whatever it found of her, the ordinary explanation does not always feel adequate. The lakes earned their legends honestly, through the sheer accumulation of unexplained loss, through the geography of fog and sudden gale and water cold enough to kill in minutes, through a silence after sinkings that the ocean, with its broader shores and more extensive drift patterns, does not always maintain so completely. What endures in these stories is something the Great Lakes share with very few places on the continent. The lakes look like inland water. They look in calm weather like something navigable and understood. The legends are a persistent correction to that impression, a reminder that the surface is not the whole story, that the water conceals as much as it reveals, that beneath the apparent calm of a summer crossing lies a bottom covered with the evidence of every time the lakes decided otherwise. The ghost ships are a kind of distributed monument, not built in stone or bronze, but assembled from memory and unease and the particular texture of not knowing, kept alive in the same waters where they were made. The question of what lies beneath those waters, haunted by legend, catalogued only in fragments, contested at every count, did not remain permanently beyond reach. The lakes kept their secrets for a long time, but the tools for finding secrets changed, and with them, the nature of what we know about the bottom of the inland seas shifted from guesswork into something far more precise. Lake Huron holds one of the most instructive places to watch that shift happen. Along Michigan's northeastern shore in the waters off Alpena, a stretch of the lake earned a name that required no elaboration for anyone who worked the freighting trade: Shipwreck Alley. The rocks and shoals and converging storm tracks of this corridor made it a natural collector of disasters across nearly 2 centuries of commercial navigation. Wooden schooners from the 1830s came to rest here in water that was cold enough to preserve them remarkably well. Bulk freighters followed in the early 20th century. The variety of vessels lost in this relatively contained area amounts to something close to a complete timeline of Great Lakes maritime history, compressed into one searchable region of a lake floor. The Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary was established in the year 2000 to protect and study what that floor contained. By the time it was expanded in 2014 to cover roughly 4,300 square miles of Lake Huron, the sanctuary had documented close to 100 shipwreck sites within its boundaries, with estimates suggesting another 100 or so still waiting somewhere in the unsurveyed stretches below. Nearly 200 wrecks in total, the documented and the estimated combined, resting in water that ranges from the shallows close to shore down to depths well below 600 feet in the lake's darker reaches. The sanctuary became, almost immediately, one of the most significant laboratories for freshwater maritime archaeology in the world, not because the wrecks it held were individually more dramatic than those in other parts of the lakes, but because the concentration was so dense, the variety so complete, and the cold, fresh water so consistently effective at slowing the decay that time would otherwise accelerate. What made the sanctuary a focal point for the broader story of wreck discovery was not only what it contained, but what it demonstrated about the gap between what we thought we knew and what was actually there. Before systematic survey work began, the wreck record in this part of the lake was assembled largely from historical accounts. harbour masters' logs, newspaper reports, the recollections of surviving crews, insurance filings that sometimes described a position and sometimes described only a general vicinity. A ship that went down in a November storm in low visibility with no survivors, left behind whatever its last port call had recorded and not much else. The position given might be accurate to within a mile, or it might be the best guess of a witness who saw something from a distance in conditions that made careful observation impossible. The old record was honest about its own limitations, but the limitations were real, and they left enormous uncertainty about where hundreds of vessels had actually come to rest. Modern survey technology began answering questions that the historical record had been unable to resolve. The autonomous surface vehicle known as Ben, a hull equipped with multi-beam sonar, GPS navigation, and the ability to work systematically across a search grid without a crew in the water, became one of the central tools for mapping the sanctuary's bottom in high resolution. Multi-beam sonar generates returns across a wide swathe of the lake bed simultaneously, producing bathymetric maps detailed enough to distinguish a vessel's outline from the surrounding sediment at depths down to 650 feet. What had once required direct visual contact from a diver, limiting serious wreck investigation to relatively shallow water, could now be conducted remotely, in darkness, in depths unreachable by any diver, with a precision that historical records never approached. When a sonar image flagged a promising target, remotely operated vehicles went down to confirm and document. ROVs equipped with cameras and lighting descended to the bottom with GPS-linked position data running continuously, so that what they photographed was simultaneously tied to a precise location. The wooden freighter Ohio, sitting at 315 feet below the surface, was GPS tagged and documented in detail using this combination of tools. A vessel that had been a name in a loss record, a footnote in a registry of disappeared ships, became a known site with exact coordinates, structural assessments, and photographic catalogues of its current condition. The transformation from legend to documented wreck was not instantaneous. It required survey time, equipment deployments, careful cross-referencing of sonar profiles against historical descriptions. But the outcome was fundamentally different from anything the historical record could provide on its own. What the surveys also revealed was how much of the sanctuary floor remained unmapped. Only roughly 20% of the sanctuary's bottom had been covered by systematic survey as of recent years, and that small fraction had already produced substantial revision of what was believed to be there. Ships that had been listed in the historical record as missing without a known resting place were turning up as definable structures on the lake floor. The gap between the approximately 100 documented wreck sites and the estimated 100 additional wrecks believed present in the sanctuary represents not the edge of what exists, but the edge of what has been looked for in sufficient detail. The implication, when extended across all 5 of the Great Lakes, is significant. If 20% coverage produces this rate of discovery in a contained sanctuary, the unsurveyed remainder of the lake's combined floor likely holds concentrations of undocumented wrecks that the existing counts do not reflect at all. This is the tension that modern underwater archaeology has introduced into the question of how many ships the lakes have actually taken. The Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum's estimate of approximately 6,000 vessels is the most widely cited figure. Some scholars argue the true count exceeds 25,000, a difference not accounted for simply by rounding, but by the recognition that the historical record captured what shore-based observers could document, not what the lake floor actually contains. The precision of sonar and ROV survey does not reconcile those two numbers. It deepens the uncertainty between them by demonstrating, in place after documented place, that the bottom holds more than the record admitted. What changed at Thunder Bay, and what is changing incrementally across other parts of the lakes as survey work expands, is the nature of the not knowing. It used to be a diffuse uncertainty, a sense that ships had vanished, that the lakes were deep, that what went down likely stayed down and stayed lost. That uncertainty fed directly into the legends, into the ghost ships and the phantom helmsmen, and the long silences after disasters that produced no survivors, no wreckage, no closure. The mystery was genuine, but it was also shapeless, because there were no tools capable of giving it borders. Now the mystery has sharper edges. The ships that have been found were genuinely unknown until sonar passed over them, and the finding of each one closes a specific story that had been left open for decades or longer. But for every wreck that sonar pulls from the category of vanished into the category of known, the surveys confirm that the unsurveyed water still holds more. The lakes remain, by any honest accounting, a largely uninspected archive. What Thunder Bay made clear is that the archive is real, that the ships are there, that the bottom holds the physical record of every storm that was too fast, every chart that was wrong, every hull that met water colder and deeper than the one it had been built to survive. The search did not end the story of what lies below. It clarified, with new precision, exactly how much of the story remains to be read. The first images came back in fragments, the way memory itself tends to work. Incomplete, uncertain, arriving in pieces that had to be assembled before the whole picture emerged. The research vessel RV Storm was working a methodical grid across the cold floor of Lake Huron in March of 2023. The autonomous surface vehicle bend sweeping multi-beam sonar returns across the sediment below in that same systematic pattern that had already added so many previously unknown structures to the sanctuary's catalogue. And then, at some depth that the records describe only as hundreds of feet below the surface, the sonar resolved itself into something unmistakable. A hull, upright, 3 masts still standing. What the sonar had found was the SS Ironton, a 191-foot 3-masted schooner barge that had slipped beneath Lake Huron on the night of September 26, 1894, and had not been seen since. The Ironton belonged to a type of vessel and a system of commerce that defined the mid to late 19th century on the Great Lakes, and that has been almost entirely forgotten in the years since. She was built in 1873 by the Niagara River Transportation Company, and she operated as part of what the trade called the consort system, a practical arrangement in which a steam-powered vessel towed one or more unpowered barges behind it, the barges riding in the steamer's wake, connected by a single line, moving cargo at a fraction of the cost of running a separate powered hull. It was efficient, it was common, and it was fragile in ways that those who worked the system understood as an ordinary condition of the job. If the tow line broke, the barge was adrift on whatever lake happened to be beneath it, dependent on whatever weather happened to be above it, and entirely at the mercy of whatever other traffic happened to be moving in the same waters. That is precisely what happened to the Ironton on that September night in 1894. The steamer Charles J. Kershaw was towing her across Lake Huron when the tow line parted. The Ironton drifted, crewless of control, into a shipping lane that was being used by another vessel, the wooden freighter Ohio, a 300-foot hull that had no way to avoid the collision in the darkness and the confusion that followed a parted tow. The Ohio struck the Ironton head-on. The Ironton sank. 5 men died, the captain and 4 members of the crew, and the wreck settled to the bottom of Lake Huron, where the cold, fresh water closed over it and the world above moved on. For more than a century, the Ironton existed in the historical record as a name in a loss register, a brief entry in harbour documentation, a casualty figure with no confirmed resting place. The Ohio herself was also lost in the same incident, and both vessels became part of the long, unresolved ledger of ships that the Great Lakes had claimed without giving back so much as a position. The consort system that had defined the Ironton's working life eventually gave way to self-powered vessels. The trade routes evolved. The names of schooner barges and their captains faded from anything except archival corners that few people visited. The Ironton became, in the most complete sense, erased, not by deliberate forgetting, but by the ordinary passage of time over a category of loss that had no one left to mourn it publicly. What the ROV cameras showed, when they descended to confirm what the sonar had outlined, was that the lake had done something remarkable to the hull in the intervening 129 years. The cold fresh water at that depth, lacking the salt that accelerates corrosion in ocean environments, and cold enough to slow biological decay to something close to a standstill, had preserved the Ironton in a condition that defied easy comprehension. The wooden hull was upright on the lake floor, structurally intact, the 3 masts still standing as they had stood when the ship was working cargo across the same lake that had swallowed it. The rigging remained, the anchor was still in place, and at the stern, secured exactly where it would have been secured on the night the Ironton went down, the lifeboat was still tethered, unused or unreachable, or simply left behind in the swift violence of a collision in the dark. It was, as NOAA researchers described it, a time capsule. A vessel that should have spent more than a century decaying into the sediment had instead been held in suspension by the particular chemistry of the lake, waiting for instruments precise enough to find it. That detail, the lifeboat still tied to the stern, carries a weight that accumulates quietly. The 5 men who died when the Ironton went down left behind a vessel that preserved, in cold and darkness, the physical evidence of the moment everything went wrong. The tethered lifeboat speaks directly to the speed of the sinking, to the chaos of a nighttime collision between 2 large wooden hulls, to the gap between a maritime safety measure and the conditions under which that measure becomes impossible to use. No amount of archival research could have produced that detail. It required presence, an ROV camera at hundreds of feet, a research team willing to look, and the particular grace of cold fresh water doing what no maritime historian could have arranged. The discovery added one more carefully documented entry to the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary's catalogue of nearly 200 wrecks, but the significance of the Ironton reached beyond the numerical addition. What the find demonstrated, with unusual clarity, was the relationship between modern technology and archival incompleteness. The historical record knew that the Ironton had sunk. It knew roughly where, and roughly when, and roughly how. But it could not close the circle. The position could not be confirmed, the physical condition could not be assessed, and the vessel itself remained a story about something that had happened, rather than something that could be visited and documented and understood in physical terms. The multi-beam sonar changed the category the Ironton occupied. The ROV completed the transformation. A tragedy that had been a set of words in a loss registry became a tangible structure at a known location, with coordinates attached to every image the cameras returned. What discoveries like this one do to the broader story of the Great Lakes is cumulative and difficult to overstate. Each recovered wreck revises, in some small way, the public understanding of what these lakes were and what happened in them. The consort system that the Ironton represents, that entire architecture of 19th century commerce, the tow lines and the schooner barges and the late-season risk calculations that captains made before setting out into water that could turn hostile in a matter of hours, becomes more real when there is a physical structure on the lake floor to anchor it. The collision hazards of an era with no radar, no reliable weather forecasting, no communication between vessels once they left port, become easier to understand when the evidence of those hazards is documented in high-resolution video. The Ironton had been missing for so long that it had essentially passed from recorded history into the category of lake legend. Another vessel absorbed by the inland sea, position unknown, story incomplete. That it came back into documented reality in 2023, upright and largely intact, masts still standing in water, that had kept it the way a cold room keeps things that would otherwise change, is the kind of quiet revelation that the lakes occasionally offer to those patient and equipped enough to search. The bottom has always held more than the surface knew. What changes incrementally and then sometimes all at once is our ability to go down and look. What the discovery of the Ironton reminded the research community, and through the coverage that followed, reminded the broader public, is that finding a wreck is only the beginning of a longer obligation. The lake can preserve a hull for a century and a quarter. What preserves the meaning of that hull? What keeps the names attached to their vessels and the vessels attached to their human stories is a different kind of institution altogether. It is the museum, the sanctuary, the underwater preserve, the dive tour operator who knows the coordinates by heart and explains the history before the first diver slips below the surface. The physical recovery of a wreck without the infrastructure to hold and transmit its significance would be, in the end, only an interesting sonar image. At Whitefish Point on the southern shore of Lake Superior, where the graveyard miles have been claiming ships since the earliest days of Great Lakes commerce, the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum has spent decades doing exactly that work. The museum holds artifacts from 10 historic wrecks preserved within the Whitefish Point Underwater Preserve, among them pieces recovered from the Comet, the John B. Cowell, the Samuel Mather, the Myron, the Niagara, and others whose names appear in the long casualty records of Superior's worst passages. Each object in the collection carries with it the whole chain of circumstances that put it on the lake floor in the first place: the weather that turned, the hull that couldn't hold, the crew that didn't come home. A ship's telegraph pulled from a wreck is not merely a mechanical object. It is the last instrument someone's hands rested on before the water came in. But there is one artifact in the museum's collection that draws visitors with a particular gravity, and it has done so since it was raised from the bottom in 1995. The bell of the Edmund Fitzgerald, recovered from the wreck site nearly 20 years after the ship went down with all 29 hands in November of 1975, sits in the museum as the most tangible remnant of a loss that still resonates. When the bell came up, a replica was lowered in its place at the wreck site. A deliberate act of exchange, giving the lake something to stand for what had been taken from it, marking the site with the acknowledgement that what rests there is not simply a structural artifact, but a grave. The original bell now bears the names of every man who died. It is in one object a monument, a memorial, and a museum centerpiece, and the weight of standing in front of it, reading those 29 names on cast metal that was once aboard a working ship, is not an abstraction. It is exactly the kind of encounter that a museum can arrange and that no amount of reading about the Fitzgerald's loss can fully replicate. The Whitefish Point Underwater Preserve extends that act of remembrance below the surface. More than 20 documented wreck sites fall under its legal protection, and within those boundaries the rules are clear. Artifact removal without a license is prohibited, the kind of prohibition that carries real consequences under heritage law. Ontario's Heritage Act, with its amendments requiring licenses for any sonar ROV or diver activity within 500 metres of a protected wreck, and fines that can reach $1 million Canadian for violations, represents one end of the regulatory spectrum. The American preserve system operates under parallel frameworks. The shared intent is the same. These sites are not salvage opportunities. They are protected spaces, cultural property in the same category as any other irreplaceable heritage site, with the additional understanding that many of them are the permanent resting places of people whose remains have never been recovered and never will be. That ethical dimension is real, and it sits at the centre of every conversation about dive tourism on the Great Lakes. Visiting a wreck is not a neutral act. The ships that went down took crews with them, and the cold fresh water that preserved wooden hulls and standing rigging with such fidelity sometimes preserved human remains as well. Divers who descend to these sites are entering spaces that function simultaneously as historical artifacts, natural habitats, and in the most direct sense, graves. The dive tourism industry that has developed around the Great Lakes wrecks has largely internalized this tension, and responsible operators teach it explicitly. The difference between an underwater museum visit and a disturbance, the value of looking without taking, the obligation to leave a wreck as it was found. The economics of that tourism are significant in ways that extend far beyond individual dive experiences. NOAA's assessments of the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary, which encompasses nearly 200 documented wrecks on the Lake Huron floor off Alpena, Michigan, estimate that maritime heritage tourism in the region generates more than $10 million in annual economic activity. That figure includes guided dive charters, equipment rentals, museum visits to the sanctuary's own interpretive centre, and the broader hospitality spending of visitors who come specifically because of what lies below the surface. The wrecks that were once purely tragedies, purely losses, have become part of a living regional economy that depends on their continued preservation precisely because the draw is authenticity. A wreck that has been disturbed, stripped of recoverable objects, or damaged by careless diving is a wreck that has lost part of what makes it worth visiting. Beneath the cultural and economic frameworks, the wrecks have also become something that no one who built or sailed them could have anticipated: functioning ecosystems. The same cold fresh water that slows decay and preserves wooden planking also supports freshwater species that have colonized the artificial reefs the wrecks have become. Lake trout, perch, and other species use the hull structures as shelter, spawning habitat and feeding grounds. A sunken schooner that went down in the 1880s is now, in ecological terms, a permanent feature of the lake floor, as integrated into the living system of the lake as any natural reef formation. The science of how wrecks function as artificial reefs in freshwater environments is still developing, and the Great Lakes, with their extraordinary wreck density, offer a scale of study unavailable anywhere else on Earth. The Thunder Bay Sanctuary has leaned into this dimension of its mission, understanding that the case for preservation is strengthened when it encompasses not just cultural heritage, but active ecological value. What emerges from all of this, from the museum bell and the preserved artifacts, from the legal frameworks protecting dive sites, from the economic activity generated by heritage tourism, from the fish that shelter in the ribs of 19th century schooners, is something that might fairly be called the modern life of the wrecks. These ships did not simply sink and disappear into historical record. They sank and became part of a complicated present, one in which science, remembrance, education, ecology, and public fascination have converged around the same submerged structures. The names that the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum keeps in its permanent collection, the names on the Edmund Fitzgerald's bell, the names in the loss registers that stretch back to the early 1800s, are not merely entries in a catalogue of disaster. They are the foundation of a living memory that the lakes, in their cold and particular way, have helped to maintain. The preservation work is, in the end, a form of insistence, an insistence that the 30,000 lives the lakes are estimated to have claimed, an approximation certainly since the early records are incomplete and many losses left no documentation at all, were not simply absorbed and forgotten, that the ships carrying those lives left behind structures that can still be visited, still be studied, still be understood, that the lake floor is not an ending. It is, in the most unexpected sense, a kind of archive. And yet, for all that has been found, mapped, named and protected, the lakes have not finished keeping their secrets. The number most often cited, around 6,000 documented shipwrecks, represents the conservative end of a range that scholars have long disputed. Maritime historian Mark Thompson has argued that the true figure is well over 25,000, a claim that transforms the known catalogue from an impressive tally into a small fraction of the actual total. The difference between those two numbers is not a statistical footnote. It is the measure of everything that was never recorded, never found, never attached to a name or a date or a route. Ships that went down in the early decades of Great Lakes commerce often left behind no paperwork, no surviving crew, no newspaper account detailed enough to fix their location. They simply vanished from the record the way a vessel vanishes into fog, completely, without a seam between their presence and their absence. What created so many losses across 2 centuries of Great Lakes shipping was not any single failure, but the persistent convergence of several. Sudden storms that built without warning on open water, with no shelter to run for. Dense fog that reduced visibility to the length of a bowsprit. Ice that came early or broke late, in ways no captain had encountered before. Hidden shoals on charts that were imprecise to begin with, drawn from surveys conducted in haste along thousands of miles of irregular shoreline. Collisions between vessels sharing narrow straits and river channels in an era before reliable communication. Fires in wooden hulls carrying cargo that burned eagerly. And underneath all of it, the relentless economic pressure to load more, sail later in the season, push through weather that should have sent a ship to anchor. Each of those causes produced its own category of wreck, its own geography of loss, its own particular kind of last few minutes aboard a ship that was no longer going to make port. The famous disasters, the 14 vessels that the storm of 1913 drove to the bottom, the Carl D. Bradley going down so fast in November 1958 that only 2 of her crew survived, the Daniel J. Morrell splitting apart in the dark in 1966, the Edmund Fitzgerald sinking in 1975 with 29 men in water that never gave them a chance. Those are the losses that the historical record kept intact. Names, faces, dates, testimonies. They entered the public imagination because there was enough documentation to hold them there. Enough survivors or witnesses or investigators to fix the details in writing. But for every one of those named disasters, there are dozens more whose entire story amounts to a notation in a harbour master's ledger. Vessel departed, vessel not arrived, vessel presumed lost, no coordinates, no cause, no names recovered from the water. Those ordinary sinkings, the ones that happen to ships no one has written a song about, belong to exactly the same long story as the Fitzgerald. They represent the daily texture of the risk that every Great Lakes sailor accepted as the condition of the work, the understanding that the lakes were not an ocean only in the sense that they were smaller, and that in every other respect the lakes could be as indifferent and as final as any open sea. The famous wrecks and the forgotten ones are not 2 different histories. They are the same history at different levels of illumination. What the continued discoveries make clear, the Ironton emerging from the darkness of Lake Huron in 2023, 128 years after it went down, is that the illumination is still incomplete and will remain so for the foreseeable future. Modern multi-beam sonar and autonomous survey vehicles have given researchers tools that no previous generation possessed, and still the lakes reveal new wrecks on their own schedule, in their own time. There are hulls resting on the bottom that no one living knows are there. There are names on those hulls that exist in no database, possibly in no surviving document at all. The mystery is not diminishing as technology improves. It is simply becoming more precise in its outlines, which only sharpens the awareness of how much remains outside them. That is, in the end, the particular character of the Great Lakes as a place in history. They are an archive, cold, preserving, meticulous in the way they hold wooden planking and iron fittings and cargo unchanged through decades. And they are a graveyard, holding the 30,000 lives lost to them in an approximation that honest historians acknowledge may be too low. Both things are true at the same time, and neither cancels the other out. The same water that swallowed a ship in November has kept it whole through winter after winter, waiting for a sonar beam or a diver's light to find it. 6,000 wrecks, or 25,000, or some number between or beyond either estimate. The lakes are not counting. They have simply kept what they were given in the cold and the dark and the silence, and they are keeping it still.